I'm recording it.
Thank you, Vasıf, so much for this kind introduction. As you can imagine, it's really a great pleasure to give this talk, especially in this newly instituted Aegean and Anatolia lecture series of ARWA, which when you say it really fast sounds like Harvard, so I like that too. I've been asked here to present some of my current thoughts on the economic and commercial role, rather, of Anatolia in early history, both as a geographical nexus between continents and as a key area of resource extraction and production. This, as you know, has been my research focus for close to 2 decades now, and I welcome the opportunity to offer an overview of where I currently see things standing to an audience primarily in archaeology. Some of you will have heard some of what I had to say before. Some of it will be new for everyone because it wasn't written 48 hours ago, but it's part of a larger narrative that I'm sort of working on trying to put together. As you all know, and as you just heard, I come to today's topic from working with one particular data set, which is that incredible assemblage of more than 20,000 commercial letters and records written on clay tablets in the cuneiform script and excavated at the archaeological site of Kültepe, ancient Kanesh near Kayseri. As is well known, these documents were written by traders coming from the Bronze Age city of Assur, present-day Iraq, who had settled far from home to do their business. They ran an extensive commercial operation stretching across what is today northern Syria, southern and central Turkey. The chance survival of their records provides the best documented example of long-distance trade anywhere in the ancient world. The basic principles of the old Assyrian commercial system have been known for more than 50 years. Here it is. Tin and high-value textiles are taken from Assur to Anatolia on donkeys and sold for cash, silver and gold, as illustrated on the graph. But only within the last decade have 3 key components of chronology, volume, and geography become well enough established to fully anchor this rather abstract model and understand the implications that trade had on the societies it involved. The first key parameter is laid out by an updated internal chronology of the period, which was published in 2012. Regardless of whether you place this internal chronology within the high or the middle or the low or the ultra low sequence, this work proves that close to 90% of the thousands of records of Kültepe dates to just 3 incredibly densely documented decades of activity. They do not represent the administrative detritus of several generations of traders, as was previously thought. Now, this obviously has important ramifications for any assessment of intensity and volume of commercial activities by restraining and condensing events within a much shorter time frame. Totaling all recorded shipments of tin and textiles across all the texts, and knowing that these cover activities during just 30 years, provides direct documentation for an annual average of around 1,000 textiles and several tons of tin carried to Anatolia by Syrian merchants. The question then is, of course, what proportion of total commercial activities survive in the records from Kültepe? And I think there's strong evidence to show that what survives is really only a tip of an iceberg. A conservative estimate based on other internal documentation would be at least 300 donkey loads traveling to Assur, from Assur to Anatolia each year, corresponding to, close to 10 tons of tin and thousands of high-value fabrics. But much higher figures even seem more probable. And a recent study by my colleague at Stratford has argued that it's much, much more. Yet, even with the more conservative estimates, the most conservative estimate, this raises important questions about production and financing and transport infrastructure and consumption. And I have repeatedly argued that the sources as we have them make sense only if we infer the existence of an extensive structure of supporting institutions and industries that are otherwise either totally or mostly invisible, both in texts and in the archaeological record. the old Assyrian case can simply not represent an anomaly or an outlier in terms of ancient trade, as has again and again been claimed by scholars inside and outside the field. Consider that the Assyrians sold most of their donkeys upon arrival in Anatolia. Now, who bred, fed, and trained the hundreds of animals needed in the trade each year? Even if some kind of donkey recycling system existed, then that too must have been managed by someone, and that someone is invisible to texts and to archaeology. Similarly, we must ask who produced the saddling and the leather goods and required to equip them, who tended the flocks of cattle, oversaw the butchering, the tanning, and the leather work, who made the ropes, who weaved the sacking, and how about the thousands of highly valuable textiles that were sold themselves? Who tended those flocks, plucked, washed, combed, dyed, and wove the fiber? And finally, what about transport? With hundreds of donkeys passing through inns in Syria and Anatolia each year, who produced their fodder? Where did the workforce come from? How was the traffic monitored and guarded? Who oversaw the maintenance of the physical infrastructure? Who guarded the roadways? Who collected the taxes? We know that Assyrian traders depended on inns along the main routes for provisions. Now, a party of 100 donkeys and a comparable number of men would obviously have required precise organization. The animals alone would consume nearly 2 tons of water per day, and the challenge of feeding them would have required detailed arrangements that were made beforehand with providers along the route. It's difficult to determine exactly how common inns were, but even small and rarely mentioned settlements in Anatolia and northern Mesopotamia can be shown to have had them. This implies that a constant and lively traffic was the rule, and shows that inns must have depended on travelers other than the occasional Assyrian for their livelihood. My point here is that services were paid for in cash metal, and the intensity and volume of traffic must therefore have had serious impacts on local economy. The demands for food and water of an inn along a main trade route would have been equal to that of a village. Its presence must have had notable consequences for local agricultural production, therefore, and networks of distribution. Manufacture would have been restructured to accommodate consumption and tied down part of the available local workforce on a seasonal basis. It's important to note that none of this is directly identified in the material or the written record, yet the very existence of the Kültepe texts necessitates that it was so. These considerations also suggest that the Anatolian commercial circuit did not stand alone. The texts from Kültepe outline the contours of a much larger system of commercial circuits. This links up to my third point about the recent revision in understanding the commercial geography of the Assyrian trade. This point is to some extent independent of the exact location of the ancient sites, although the commercial geography does, of course, set limits for where you can place certain entities on a map. But rather, the commercial geography is important for understanding the patterns of trade that it followed, where traders went and where they did not go. It has been clear for some time that the merchants of Assur were linked into a commercial network that they did not themselves control. This other network was the one that brought a large part of the goods that the merchants in Assur would then purchase and take up to Anatolia for sale. This network brought a large number of textiles and all the tin involved in the trade on Anatolia. More recent is the realization that the Assyrian commercial network was also for a significant part itself one of wholesale and transit. This explains another stunning observation that has become clear from the study of both quantification and its relation to geography, namely why some places in particular constituted such large markets for Assyrian trade goods in Anatolia. It has long been realized that Purushadum was a significant market for Assyrian goods. This was previously linked to a particular socio-political prominence and or control of prominent silver mines that would have supplied and supported its purchasing power. But while the exact location of Purushadum remains hotly debated, there is no evidence to suggest that the city would have controlled geological sources of silver other than the fact that the Assyrian merchants sold a lot of stuff there for silver and gold, incidentally. And the quantification of goods shipped to Purushadum does not seem to support either explanation. As shown recently by Hakan Erol, The acquisition of silver and gold, which had the primary function as currency, in addition to being a commodity in their own right, took place mainly in 3 cities in Anatolia: Kanesh, Burj-Hadum, and Waqshushana. The 2 latter cities together, as you can see from these graphs, represent nearly half of all Assyrian sales in Anatolia made outside of Kanesh. If we look at the tin and copper trade, the numbers are even more staggering, with the 2 cities standing for the purchase of nearly 3/4 of all metal that was sold by the Assyrians. Now, it's very hard to imagine why Burj-Hadum and Waqshushana in particular would want to even be able to consume nearly all of the tin and copper traded in Anatolia during the 30-year period covered by our sources. And while people have speculated about Burj-Hadum's political prominence and alleged control of silver sources, remember that nothing of the sort has been put forward about Waqshushana, and yet it seems to have rivaled Burj-Hadum and Kanesh in terms of importance within the Assyrian commercial system. As I argued in my 2011 study of the Anatolian historical geography, the reason has to be the role of certain cities as major markets. Burj-Hadum and Waqshushana were probably neither above average consumers nor exceptionally rich in silver ore. Instead, like Assur itself, they were transitional markets that connected the Assyrian commercial network to other circuits and were conversion points into regions where merchants from Assur themselves did not have access. Keeping this in mind, it's equally important to note that certain regions are completely absent in the Assyrian records. Even large and presumably significant areas, such as the Upper Tigris or lowland Cilicia, never appear in the text at Kültepe. This is particularly remarkable since the Assyrian merchants never appear. What is particularly remarkable is that the Assyrian merchants never appear to have crossed the Amanus or ascended the Cilician gates to the Konya-Karaman plain. Almost regardless of where scholars have argued for the location of Burj-Hadum, this would clearly represent a shorter and more economically feasible route, as shown here by Alessio Palmisano on his maps that are showing sort of gradients in the landscape and the ease, or rather the cost of travel. The one on the left is the shortest route from Assur to Kanesh in terms of cost. So I see this absence as a result of Western Asia at this time being divided into competing states and networks of commercial monopolies managed by treaty. There were therefore zones which were commercially off limits to the traders of Assur, just as they in turn protected their monopolies. Drafts of political and commercial treaties survived to support the notion that trade was based on mercantilist principles of protectionism. In some territories, such as Syria, east of the Euphrates, the Assyrians had treaties of transit. In the areas west of the Euphrates, the Assyrians held treaties that allowed them to both transit and trade, east of the Amanus. And yet other areas, such as Cilicia, seemingly forbade any access to Assyrian merchants. Cities along the routes, states perhaps I should say along the routes, because that is the same thing at this period, levied taxes in return for a guaranteed safety of passage. By the turn of the 2nd millennium BC, such monopolies were seemingly drafted and crafted by a small number of states that essentially specialized in long-distance trade. These specialized cities included Assur, but also Sippar and probably EBLA. Competition could be fierce. A preserved draft for a treaty with the local ruler published by Chechen and Hecker famously includes a stipulation about outsiders coming to trade with the state claimed in the Assyrian network. Quote, if they come to your land, you must hand them over to us so that we may kill them, unquote. So I believe that it's possible to trace the development of this protectionist model of trade. And what I'll do today is to try and project that back into the early Bronze Age and argue that what we see in the records from Kültepe evolved from the gradual establishment of a multi-layered and multi-centered structure of interlocking circuits which in spite of not being in direct touch, formed an interdependent organism of sorts in which events at one end of the system affected conditions in some ways all the way over the other end. I would suggest that such earlier networks in the early Bronze Age were smaller, but operated under similar conditions and were driven by the same abstract notions of value and profit and arbitrage managed by specialists. They too were seemingly strongly supported, but never wholly controlled by state institutions. And their traders were also to a large extent self-organized and bore the risks involved in conducting exchange over large distances. The states provided safety, legal support, and physical infrastructure in return for tolls. Concretely, the system can be traced now back into the 25th century BCE, but I don't see any compelling reason why it wouldn't have existed in much earlier times and earlier forms as well. It might in fact be coeval with state itself and be part of what initially drove the state formation process. Now I'm kind of losing myself into the field of archaeology, where I am, as you well know, not an expert. The best documented precursor for the old Assyrian system comes to us through EBLA in the 24th century BCE. And as you all know, with these texts, they've been studied and studied over the past half century. But I would say that just within the last 5 years, there has been a profound reorientation, commercial reorientation in how to interpret them by scholars such as Biga, Bonecki, Winters, and Steinkeller. Now, everyone agrees that the archives of Palace G at EBLA yield references to huge amounts of silver. And it's very likely that most of it must have come from Turkey. It seems likely, at least to me, that the contemporary grand public buildings that are being excavated at the moment in central Anatolia, including those at Kültepe, shown here, Karahöyük, Yassıhöyük, should be linked to a dialectic development of political centralization and long-distance trade. Really what we are seeing on the ground is sort of an earlier image of what we get again in the Middle Bronze Age. Now this picture fits really well with the corpus of research produced by Şahoğlu, Efe, Arslan, and others, beginning with Şahoğlu, who traced deep qualitative changes in settlement structure, pottery assemblages, and routes and exchange patterns from the Euphrates Valley to Western Anatolia during the latest phase of the early Bronze Age, and linked also those networks spanning into Mesopotamia, the Caucasus, and especially the Eastern Mediterranean. But the chance survival of the Palace G archives at EBLA alone puts this exchange system into a perspective in terms of volume, extent, and organization in the same way as Kültepe does 500 years later. And the amounts at EBLA too are staggering. A single text from EBLA mentions 2.4 tons of silver in bars, so we know that it's physical. And this has serious implications, obviously, for the political and economic infrastructure of the region that produced this metal, exactly as I argued for the Middle Bronze Age. As in the old Assyrian example, this would have required a network of settlements, of production sites, of managerial coordination capable of supporting the mining and the processing and the transport. In this example, we may speculate that the silver was refined out of 200 tons of galena ores in a process that would have required up to 2,000 tons of fuel. Volume, therefore, is key to understanding not only the nature of the commercial circuits, but also to know what we should look for in the archaeological surveys and excavations on the ground. The censors that managed these operations can't have been trivial players, I would assume. Yener's pioneering work in the Niğde province has identified hundreds of mining galleries and ore processing sites that provided a detailed picture of the conditions under which metallic ores were retrieved and refined. Silver ores associated with ancient workings have also been found in numerous other locations along the southern Taurus Fold, as shown here on a map adapted from the one that Michele Massa produced half a decade ago. Copper was, of course, even more readily available, with the main sources including the Black Sea mines and Ergani. One text from EBLA mentions 1,850 lance heads of bronze and 3,680 lance heads of copper. Another talks of 1,000 lance heads of bronze and 250 blades. The copper used to make these objects probably also mainly came from Anatolia, although more distant sources in Oman could also be in play. There's not much evidence to suggest that the copper of Cyprus has yet really come into play. The early Bronze Age centers in central Turkey were therefore likely the main organizers and beneficiaries of such industries, bringing in colossal wealth and triggering deep changes in the fabric of society, seen in the rise of the great public buildings of the period, such as the one that Professor Şahoğlu is excavating right now at Kültepe. We can compare this to the great prosperity evidenced in the list of annual revenues compiled at EBLA around the same time. These are lists that are simply writing down how much money is coming into the treasure box of EBLA every year. These revenue texts were discussed recently by my Harvard colleague, Professor Steinkeller. And as he points out, they record in one case as much as 5 tons of silver and 900 kilograms of gold as income over a period of 3 years. Again, given that the main source of EBLA's silver and gold was almost certainly Anatolia, this reflects back on the mining industry, even if most of the metal presumably represents currency that is constantly in circulation. A large part of the silver and gold mentioned, he can show, entered EBLA through trade with a state called Armi. People have debated its exact location, as you know, but it seems clear now that Armi should be sought in Cilicia, as proposed by Marco Bonecchi already 3 decades ago. It was seemingly a large territorial entity with multiple urban settlements and fortifications, ruled by a king and assemblies of elders. It was also an economically very powerful state, whose archival footprint at EBLA is second only to that of Mari. From no other place did so many travelers come to EBLA, especially merchants, the Lukar. EBLAites are likewise seen traveling to and from Armi on a regular basis. Armi never appears to have been the destination of a voyage. Armi even appears to have been the destination of a voyage carried out by the king of EBLA himself. And the ruler of Armi was at least on one occasion visiting EBLA. For Armi in turn, EBLA functioned as the key intermediary in dealings with states further east and south. It was through EBLAite intercession that Armi had access to the equid markets in the upper Habur, especially at Nagar, and it was through EBLA's intercession that they maintained commercial dealings with Mari and Kish on the Euphrates. The sale of equids in Syria has only recently come into focus in the texts, and it will be highly exciting to see what the analysis of the many early Bronze Age equid skeletons from a place like Tel Leilan can tell us. Harvey Weiss and his team are readying for publication. As in the later Old Assyrian example, textiles also play a central role in the EBLA documentation. This was pointed out already as early as 1986 by Ignaz Gelb, who speculated that it might in fact have been the main source of the state's prosperity. Indeed, textiles and felt and raw wool figure very prominently in the palatial documentation, and it's clear that large numbers of sheep were held in EBLA's territory and that many textiles were produced there, both for internal consumption and for export. However, as Steinkeller, Biga, Bonecchi, and Winters now argue, EBLA also imported significant volumes of textiles, especially from Mari and Nagar and the Habur. And the contours of a more complex commercial circuit, nearly 500 years the forerunner of the old Assyrian system, seems to be emerging from newly intensified studies that these people are conducting. Steinkeller, in his most recent work, proposes that the main source of EBLA's income may not have been from production, but in fact from its role in intermediary trade. He has been around an old Assyrianist for 10 years after all. The importance of Anatolia in this system is evident from his tabulation of EBLA's chief imports and particularly their geographical directionality, as I've tried to show on this map. 1. Lapis lazuli, carnelian, tin, carapaces, seashells, textiles, and wool came from Mari and traveled through EBLA to destinations that include Armi. 2. Silver, gold, and tin come from Armi. 3. Timber, wine, vinegar, and fish sauce come from Armi and probably the Amuk, if cadmium is correctly placed on that map. And this is something that we'll be discussing over the next semester. 4. Kunga equids, whatever they are, type of mules. Sheep and wool comes chiefly from Nagar and other localities in northern Mesopotamia. 5. Elephant and hippopotamus ivory, linen textiles, gold, and various semi-precious stones come from Dulu and Dugurasu, places which Boneki, Biga, Winters, and Steinkeller now all identify with Byblos and Egypt, respectively. Tin, silver, and lapis lazuli then goes in the opposite direction from EBLA to Dulu and Dugurasu. Much of the ivory and the linen coming from there and coming into EBLA were apparently transshipped to Mari, which almost certainly resold a large part of that again to cities in Anatolia. So the image we get is one similar to what we have later on, like Assur and Purushadam half a millennium later. Early dynastic EBLA and Mari thus seem to have been facilitators of regional market and tied together areas of extraction and manufacture and consumption, both as producers and as middlemen. Steinkeller's detailed study of EBLA's timber trade to Mari, which came out a couple of months ago, suggests that it too was mostly destined for further sail downriver to the population centers of northern Babylonia. In addition, olive oil produced at EBLA itself went to Mari and Dulu and Nagar, while textiles, some of which may originally have been imported from Mari and Nagar and other sources, were traded to Armi and throughout northern and southern Syria. So there's a textile cycle going on, again, similar to what we see in the Middle Bronze Age, with high-grade luxury products. Okay, so we're still very much in the infancy of understanding the early Bronze Age commercial network, but it's clear already that the texts from Palace G. EBLA add 3 important components to the point I have been trying to make. One of chronology, by providing direct evidence for a commercial system 500 years the ancestor of the old Assyrian texts. One of intensity, by providing quantifiable data set for large-scale production and commercial interaction. And it has helped a lot that many of the EBLA texts are now online and searchable, and one can do these kinds of things. And finally, third, one of mercantilist geography, by providing an outline of a system operating on what appears to be a similar mode of interlocking commercial circuits. But it's only because we have the old Assyrian evidence that we can begin to speculate that something similar might be the case in EBLA, and there's of course a real danger for tautologies to appear, so this has to be gone through very carefully. I look very much forward to the fall here, where Steinkeller and I are going to co-teach a seminar on the EBLA trade and the Middle Bronze Age systems, and see what comes out of that, and invite colleagues to come and discuss with us, because now we have Zoom. Importantly, like the historically later example from Kültepe, this system was also managed by commercial agents, the Lukar, and they were settled in ports, Karkar. Some of these ports appear to have been even larger than what we know from Kültepe, including a colony of traders from Mari who had settled at the town of Tunip at EBLA, which Boneki in 2016 showed numbered as many as 490 traders, their wives, and their support personnel, probably well over 1,000 people. As in the old Assyrian case, the state would levy tolls and taxes on the trade, and in a fashion comparable to what we see in the Middle Bronze Age, the records found in Palace G reflect the role of the state in maintaining security and actively building and renewing diplomatic ties and entering treaties to facilitate commerce. I emphasize that these texts are still very difficult to read, that people can argue about details probably for the next 50 years, but the picture that is emerging overall seems pretty clear. What is also interesting to me is that major difference between the sources from EBLA and those from Kültepe stemming from the fact that the EBLA archives were produced in an institutional context, while the Kültepe texts came exclusively from the houses of the private merchants. This introduces an evidentiary bias that we have to take care to disambiguate, but ideally, it also allows us to contrast the two different viewpoints and infer what might be missing from the documentation of either case, while remaining cautious of chronological and cultural differences. The sources from EBLA provide evidence for a wide variety of items, not only textiles, wool, timber, and metals, but also diverse type of prepared food items, resins, aromatics, ivory and stones, wine, salt, and oil. The texts from Karnish on their part provide information about logistics and travel, and also reflect indirectly on the supporting industries that are mostly invisible in the EBLA records. Going down in time to the end of the third millennium, the regional scale of integration appears to have grown out of the unified power of the Mesopotamian alluvium under the dynasty of Ur. This development appears paralleled in the intensified circulation of tin from sources in the east, and may even have been its most decisive precipitating feature. Moving by land and by watercourse, imperial representatives, messengers, and partially state-supported merchants seem to have been continuously in motion, with little regard for formal political boundaries. With state support, they did much to establish Anatolian silver as a standard of exchange also in the south. The major tin sources close to Mesopotamia that would be capable of supplying the entire sphere of interaction still eludes us. The Zagros, possible but not yet adequately candidates have been identified in these mountains of Iran. Much larger findings have been made in Central Asia, where joint investigations of the archaeometallurgical group in Freiburg, the Mining Museum in Bochum, and the Institutes of Archaeology in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan have revealed two important tin deposits in the Zerafshan Valley. These substantial operations were demonstrably exploited from the beginning of the second millennium BCE, and one likely source, therefore, of the Assyrian tin. Still further away, in the Altai Mountains and the adjoining ridges, we find some of the biggest tin deposits in all of Central Asia. They are located in the border region between Kazakhstan, Russia, Siberia, Mongolia, and China, in areas home at this point only to transhuman forest steppe nomads. The intense mineral exploitation that appears there, therefore, must effectively have been organized by non-state actors, perhaps in ways not unlike what we see in the Omani copper extraction around the same time. There were cultural groups, particularly one called the Tazabagjab of the Andronovo complex, who are known to have been in direct and sustained contact with the Oxus cities and the Fergana Valley, and who may have acted, therefore, as the vectors of large-scale metal trade. It is striking that in this context, the tin used in bronze objects dated to the early Bronze Age and found all the way over at Hisarlik on the western limits of Asia Minor, that these had recently been sourced to remote and geologically ancient deposits, such as those found in eastern Kazakhstan at Askarlı. These results are still unsubstantiated, but would constitute a further indication that even very distant deposits may have formed part of a larger long-distance network extending essentially across the Eurasian continent from early on, and that the intensity and volume reflected in the records from Kültepe do not represent an anomaly or innovation as much as a gradual intensification and specialization of commercial patterns established over centuries. The pottery found near the mines of Karnab and La Paz and Shangali and Mushiston in Central Asia, as well as a series of radiocarbon samples collected with those sites, date back to the 19th century BCE, which again would fit with the possible intensification of trade mirrored in the Assyrian evidence. Partzinger and Borovka and Cherny proposed that the settlements, the mines, and the smelting workshops that they identified in the Kızılkum desert can't only have centered on a local market. They're simply too large that they must have exported metal to more densely populated areas east and west. The eastward expansion of the Andronovo culture in what corresponds to the early Bronze Age in Mesopotamia has recently been linked to the search of metals. Thus, the flourishing of the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex, more lovingly known as BMAC, 2300 to 1700, overlapping with our late Bronze Age and early Middle Bronze Age, late early Bronze Age and early Middle Bronze Age, and its intensifying contacts with Andronovo from 2000 BCE onwards, can perhaps be connected to exactly the long distance exchange in raw materials. This is all very big picture, obviously, but the region of the tin sources in East Kazakhstan were likewise settled by itinerant pastoralists belonging to what people call the Andronovo cultural horizon, and these seem to have been involved in tin extraction on a very large scale from the late 3rd millennium onwards. Research on the western and northern borders of China and Mongolia have thus demonstrated the presence of mostly copper objects with links to communities on the eastern flank of the Eurasian steppe. The dating of copper and tin bronze metallurgy in China, too, is now being dated to around 2000 BC. So do we have an actual age of tin trade here? And people there, Chinese archaeologists, have been seen to have said that this implies a relatively rapid adoption rather than indigenous innovation, spreading a toolkit from the steppe fringes of how to do tin. The emergence of a full-blown sort of, here are some of these places near the BMAC culture there, Tazabagjab and so on. The emergence of a full-blown tin bronze metal production all the way down in Southeast Asia, now I'm far from Turkey, I know, from the early to the mid 2nd millennium BC, has, as demonstrated at sites in places like Thailand and Vietnam, have also been linked to the same development of ideas and possibly even the movement of metalworking communities from the steppe and from the steppe forest zones. Current debates concern how Eurasian metals and metallurgical technology were transmitted so rapidly across China's vast expanse to northern Southeast Asia, and by what routes, supporting the notion that the large-scale use of tin bronzes may in fact have formed part of what one might call a single culture package across Asia, can perhaps be sought in the Akkadian word for tin itself. Anakum in Akkadian, first attested in the Old Assyrian and Old Babylonian texts of the early 2nd millennium, indeed seems to represent a culture word, a kulturwort, mirrored in the Sanskrit naga, and the word presumably came to Mesopotamia alongside a new influx of metal from the east. Closer to home, this was my big picture. Now we're swinging back again. There seems to have been a multitude of tin sources supplying the population census of the Bronze Age world, some presumably blinking in and out of existence on a scale of chronological resolution that we in archaeology no longer have, it's no longer visible to us. There would likewise have been several and constantly shifting routes leading from the core extraction areas to the centers of distribution and consumption. Small-scale extraction of tin has recently even been shown to have taken place within the territory of Kanesh itself during a time when tons of tin were imported from Assyria. The overall system was clearly complex and flexible and surely prone to major shifts. On the other hand, the texts from Kültepe also show that the international commercial circuit as a whole must have been adaptive enough to secure reliable shipments for generations. Definite signs of the physical infrastructure that would have facilitated a large-scale exchange outside of what we see in these Assyrian texts and their very narrow horizon seems almost entirely invisible. Yet the great volume of tin handled by the Assyrian merchants proves that sustained resource extraction and exchange must have taken place on the fringes of the urban world and probably over a vast area. What forms such exchanges would have taken is also unknown. I doubt that it would all have been trade. But as argued by Ramstorff in his study of early Bronze Age weights, the weight system in use from the Aegean to the Indus during the late 3rd millennium, though following local standards, appear to have converged and become synchronized with each other, seemingly, he says, as a result of persistent and large-scale trans-regional interaction. That would be sort of a, if not a smoking gun, then at least a shadow on the wall. The quasi-industrial model of intensive agriculture and textile production evidenced in southern Mesopotamia during the 3rd millennium BCE allowed a huge surplus production of high-quality fabrics that apparently came to act as a power engine in a commercial mechanism that ultimately linked the entire old world. Links between the Anatolian coast, Thrace, and the islands grew stronger and increasingly complex, as shown by Şahoğlu, Erkanal, Özdoğan, and others. How and whether changes in environmental conditions around 2200 BCE may have upset this and other change of interlocking commercial networks is unclear, but the Ur-3 state with its standing armies and administration and messenger networks was certainly a forceful exponent of increased demand for the control of trade routes and resources, and may even represent the end result of a nucleation of populations in riparian zones. It seems that patterns consolidated during the Ur-3 state in turn came to be developed and expanded by its successors, the Old Assyrian and Old Babylonian period. The political fragmentation of the region may even have led to an increase in trade with new fluid contested political settings that encouraged independent efforts of miners and merchants and transporters in small states. The Eastern Old Assyrian period, even though it involved structural devolution in some socio-political features, seems to have broken through the rigidities of centralized statecraft. Perhaps combined with a return to rain-fed agriculture across northern Syria, we see a vigorous and venturesome development of urban centers and also the major trade routes out of Mesopotamia, Mari, EBLA, Hachum, and Karkemish in Syria, Kanesh, Durhumit, Washushana, and Purushadum in Anatolia. The Assyrian accounts document one such trade route and its auxiliaries. It is unclear under what commercial monopoly the regions beyond the Assyrian zone may have belonged, but possible candidates include EBLA in southern Anatolia, working in southern Anatolia, with Eblaite traders occasionally mentioned as buyers of Anatolian copper in the Assyrian texts. Ebla's historical links to Cilicia in the Amanus in the 3rd millennium could explain why the Assyrian traders were prevented from ever entering those regions. That the Assyrians themselves were not alone in trading in Anatolia is also known from the discovery of a handful of texts at Kültepe that are neither Assyrian nor local Anatolian. They use a language, layout, and doctrines different from the Old Assyrian one and seem to be belong to the scribal traditions of Syria. Also, the personal names in those texts appear to be Hurrian, Amorite, and yet they deal with the exact same mundane matters as their Assyrian cousins, trade and legal disputes. The fact that the characteristic Assyrian doctrines and style of writing came to be adopted by state administrations across central Anatolia, Hattusha, and even in a small place like Kamankaleri, suggests to me that the region as a whole would have been solidly part of the Assyrian commercial sphere. On the other hand, the presence of these outside texts, even at Kültepe, implies that the situation may have been different in immediately neighboring areas such as Cilicia, and that there is so much that we yet don't know. There is good evidence that merchants from Sippar during the same period traded with Ema, with Karkemish, and with Hashum. And excavations at Tilmenhuyuk recently produced sealings of merchants coming from Sippar. Texts found in Sippar itself record traffic in some of the same items known in the Assyrian records: kutanum, textiles, amutum, metal, and lapis lazuli. They also reflect the direct trade between Sippar and Eshnuna and refer to the existence of commercial procedures comparable to those known from the Assyrian records, the Narukum and the Ikribum. There are even texts pointing to the existence of a permanently settled merchant colony, a karum of traders from Sippar in Susa, comparable to the Assyrian settlements in Anatolia. An archive of cuneiform texts published a few months ago by Rins de Boer adds actual detail to the organization of trade in the south. These records, which are contemporaneous with the bulk of our Old Assyrian archives at Kültepe, link Sippar to routes that brought tin across the Zagros and down the Diyala River, and refer to a network of caravans and permanently stationed agents that shipped tin from the east and copper from Dilmun along the Euphrates via Mari into Syria. The presence of a cadre of merchants from Sipa in Mari and Mishlan on the Middle Euphrates further supports the notion that this city, Sipa, was a central player in a network that supplied the Levant with goods from Iran and the Gulf, parallel to, but running south of, I imagine, the area dominated by the Assyrian traders. A clue that Western Asia saw a major shift in the intensity of commercial network in raw tin comes from animal bones found in household waste deposits from sites as far apart as the Upper Tigris and the southern Levant. While tin bronzes are attested and well attested in relation to large public institutions long before 2000 BC, their distribution may have changed abruptly sometime around the beginning of the Middle Bronze Age, as suggested by analyses of cut marks made on animal bones conducted by zooarchaeologist Haskell Greenfield and his team. His published work has so far concentrated on sites in Israel, but ongoing studies on material from Kültepe in Anatolia are reported to produce similar results. The early Bronze Age assemblages of animal bones from domestic contexts across a number of sites suggest that about 90% of the processed fauna was butchered using stone implements, and then only some 10% of the animals were carved by metal tools. This pattern reverses in layers dating after 2000 BC, so that 10% of the bones only bear the markings of stone tools, and 90% are cut with metal. As you can see, the published data set remains limited, but if these findings can be further corroborated over the coming years, they too suggest that metal implements may have entered common household contexts quite abruptly and support the notion that the large quantities of tin and copper recorded from the text at Kültepe form part of a geographically much wider shift in patterns of commerce and consumption. Perhaps metal knives becoming a household resource was ultimately an effect of the aggressive commercial agenda of the Ur-3 state. Certainly, it appears to coincide with the establishment of the trading system evidenced in the records from Kültepe a few generations later. I will now briefly look at the end of it all. The end of direct commercial interactions between Mesopotamia and Anatolia are poorly understood, although here too important new evidence has surfaced in recent years. One important such data set comes from the unfortunately illicitly excavated archives of a state named TIKUNANI, dated to the second half of the 17th century BCE. A number of these texts were edited recently by Andrew George on the basis of transliterations done by Wilfred Lambert back in the 1980s when these texts surfaced in London. The current whereabouts are mostly unknown. This is a great pity because it's obvious that they would lend enormous amounts of new evidence to us all. But at least what we can say on what little is available at the moment, they appear to reflect a system that remains of local sort of palatial administration and still refers to Assyrian traders crossing the Syrian Jazeera regularly during the mid-1600s. To some extent, they even seem to reflect ongoing business. However, they also hint at important changes in the commercial system. For instance, a letter exchanged between the ruler of Ashur and Tikunani debates the Assyrian right of transit through the town of Shimala. This city, Shimala, is known from the earlier Kültepe text to have controlled the main crossing of the Euphrates on the Mesopotamian side of the river, opposite Hachum, maybe Lidar or thereabout. It now appears that this town was under Tikunani. The ruler of Assur states that, quote, the port of Shimala has been a great port, Kargal, since very ancient times, and makes an effort to protect the traffic of envoys and caravans traveling back and forth. Another text from Tikunani reports on a certain, quote, Ashurabi, a trader of Burundum, who is said to have brought up 2/3 pounds of tin as an audience gift for the palace to ask the king of Hachum for a war chariot, unquote. The mention of tin points to continuities in metal trade. The fact that a merchant with an Assyrian name is said to be from Burundum and negotiates directly with the ruler of Hachum about valuable prestige objects also points to me to fundamental change in mandate and hierarchy of the Assyrian commercial settlements. During the late 17th century, political change seems to have introduced growing constraints on Assyrian access to trade goods from the south. An apparent increase in Babylonian commercial activities in the Trans-Tigris, documented by people like Franz van Koppen, during the last quarter of the 17th century, suggests that trade was shifting into new patterns. Babylonian skirmishes with Elam, Kassite settlers in the East Tigris, like Tell Muhammad there, internal conflict, and the rise of the Sealand dynasty in the south are all likely to have affected those earlier routes leading to Assur from Susa, Ur, and Nippur in the south, the routes that Assur was dependent upon for its tin and probably much of its textiles. Perhaps due to the gradual attrition of the delicate political and commercial network that brought steppe tin into Mesopotamia and thence to the Mediterranean coast since the early Bronze Age, a new network of tin trade arose with its origin in Cornwall. Recent archaeometallurgical studies suggest that this network became the dominant supplier of tin for the urban centers of Egypt and Western Asia from the 17th century onwards, as quoted here. By the second half of the second millennium, we can certainly see that Assur too was buying tin in the Levant. The recently published excavation of the Sealand site of Tel Haiba near Ur likewise points to a major reorientation of the de-distribution patterns and suggests that southern Babylonia in the late Bronze Age was no longer a commercial entrepot in the metal trade, at least not in tin. Campbell et al. Report, quote, generally low levels of tin in almost all copper artifacts at concentrations that were unlikely to give any benefit as deliberate alloys. This may suggest local reuse and resmelting of metalwork with increasing dilution and mixing between true bronzes and pure copper. This may be consistent with Tel Haiba being in a position quite far down the supply chain and reliant on reuse and recycling. I would take that a step further, unquote, by the way. I would take that a step further and say that it could also signal a general and broader, more wide collapse of the tin trade. And of course, the Sealand kind of at this time being on the wrong side of Kassite Babylonia, vis-a-vis where the tin was coming from. The final end to specifically the Assyrian trade in Anatolia likely came with the military activities of Hattushili I and his nephew, Moshili I, after 1620 or so. In some ways, the annals of Moshili and Hattushili especially read like a destruction catalogue of the main commercial settlements in what had been the Assyrian trade 2 centuries earlier. Major places were razed in what seems to have been an almost systematic effort of devastation. Surviving cities such as Ninasha, Ankuwa, and Khurama became, as well as the rebuilt city of Hattushas itself, of course, became residences for the extended royal family. As shown recently by Kolakolu, the site of Kültepe was almost entirely abandoned at some point before 1500, and Klughorst has since suggested that its court may have moved to Hattush. The Hittite laws, which date to the early monarchy, contain regulations on the invulnerability of merchants in probable continuation of ancient custom, but no mention is made anymore of merchants from outside of Anatolia. Hittite campaigns across the Taurus into Syria and the destruction of first Urshum and Chachum and then Aleppo during the last quarter of the 17th century were probably devastating to the Assyrian trade network. And the political vacuum created by the Hittite expansion and subsequent collapse after Moshili's raid on Babylon in 1595 or whenever further instigated a transformation of the region into what became the state of Mitanni. The Hittite campaign to Babylon, whatever its scope and nature and whether it even happened, was linked with political and dynastic change in northern Babylonia, that's for sure, and may permanently have transformed commercial interactions between Assur and the south. The much later Marduk prophecy, if we can take that for anything, claims the establishment of a Babylonian trade circuit in Anatolia during the gods' alleged 24-year sojourn in Hatti, which followed the raid. The text even casts his stay in a positive light. But the emergence of a gold standard in Kassite Babylonia, while they continued to use copper and tin in the Middle Assyrian state, while Nuzi, Syria, and the Levant used the silver standard during the centuries that followed. To me, this all hints at a fundamental fragmentation into the patterns of directionality of trade. This may be linked to shifts in royal power, to territorial integration, to the apparent end of the metal trade from the east by land and by sea. During the course of this talk, I hope to have shown how the solidity of the Assyrian commercial dataset from Kültepe allows us to infer the existence of a high-intensity trans-regional commercial circuit just after 2000 BC. Building from that outwards in different rings and different directions, I argue that this circuit cannot have stood alone, that it requires extensive manufacture and infrastructure and other commercial circuits on a local and regional scale able to sustain it. The old Assyrian texts bring evidence for an interlocking system of commercial networks that formed a supra-regional, multi-centered and interdependent structure, which would allow steppe tin and Anatolian and Omani copper to move in such quantities that it could cause an apparent shift in the butchering marks found on household waste in southern Israel. This trade system grew out of precedents, perhaps as old as the state itself, but certainly well attested since the Palace G archives of EBLA in the 24th century BCE. That system too was based on private enterprise and permanent commercial settlements actively promoted through state support. Shifting mercantilist circuits continued to function, at least until the period of major territorial and political integration of the late Bronze Age, when both social order and resource areas appear to have gone through a great phase of reorientation. Sources point to an international exchange on a continental scale, whose volume and intensity is set fully into context and proportion only by the unlikely survival of a bunch of old Assyrian records left behind at Kültepe 4,000 years ago. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much.